Hi guys, Brian from Boas here. An important part of the locality boa hobby is being confident that the boa that you have is truly of the stated locality. But are some sellers changing the locality of boas for whatever reason? And how can you best deal with this? Those are the questions I'm going to address in today's video. So first I wanted to give a little bit of background about why I'm doing this video. And the reason is that there was a situation that was recently brought to my attention. And so on the online reptile classifieds, there was a group of animals identified as Guyana true red-tailed boas. And they were up for sale by a reptile supplier. I'm not going to say which reptile supplier. But these animals were clearly labeled as Guyana red-tailed boas. And there were pictures of them. You know, each individual animal had a picture. But then fast forward a few months and another reptile seller is selling what appears to be the same exact animals as Suriname red-tailed boas. And so I'll say that both of these reptile sellers are fairly well known. They've been around for quite a long time. But it appears that the locality of the boas has changed. The first person was calling them Guyana boas and the second person is calling them Suriname boas. So what exactly is going on here? So first of all, how do we know that they're the same animals? Well, as you probably know, every single boa has a unique pattern. The shape of the saddles, the number of the saddles it's different. It's like almost like a fingerprint in humans. And so you could say, well, you know, a few saddles might look similar, but then you look at the tail and the shape of the blotches on the tail is completely different, something like that. But if you look at a boa and all of the markings appear to be pretty much the same, it's pretty strong evidence that you're looking at two pictures of the same boa. For example, this Suriname red tail produced here back in 2016, there's no other boa on the earth that looks exactly like her. And I could even say that there's probably no ever boa that will exist in the history of life that will have the exact same markings as this particular animal. It's like a fingerprint in a human. It's always going to be slightly different. No two are going to be the same. So what also makes this example compelling is that we're talking about a group of boas. There were multiple boas. And if you compare them, they all have pretty much identical markings. So that, the odds of this happening by chance are pretty damn small. I will say that the pictures are a little bit different. The angle and the lighting is a little bit different. And, some of the pictures, you can't see all of the markings. But, the animal that's in the picture that you can compare looks, I would say, 99.9% confidence is that this is the same animal. So it's pretty obvious that somebody has animals that were sold by a previous seller and now they're selling them with a different description as Suriname red tails rather than as Guyana red tails. I wanted to make clear that it's not important who these sellers are. This is just an example that I'm using for this video. There's numerous other examples of similar things going on. And, other than that the description has changed from Guyana to Suriname, there's no red flags that would suggest that there's any kind of fraudulent thing going on here, scams or anything like that. But, with that being said, I wanted to just think about why would a person potentially change the description of a boa from a Guyana to a Suriname. And so the first idea that comes to mind that a lot of people have put forth is that they can justify increasing the price of the animal. And so it should be noted that the price was increased by almost twofold between the first seller and the second seller. So on the surface that might appear to support this interpretation. However, I will also say that at least right now it doesn't appear that Guyana boas are selling for less than Suriname boas. So given, two boas of the same quality from either Suriname or Guyana, I would expect them to sell for about the same price. I mean, if we go back in the past, 10, 15, 20 years ago, Surinames were indeed a little more popular and they might sell for higher prices than Guyana boas. But these days I don't see that that is the reason why, because Guyana boas have become very popular in the last decade or so. So I don't see that accounting for the difference. So what are some other reasons? Well, what I think is probably going on here is probably one of the following two reasons. So the first is just simple negligence. The person has a lot of things going on, a lot of projects, a lot of other reptiles that they're dealing with, and they just simply forgot that they were Guiana boas, and they, Guiana and Suriname, for all intents and purposes, are pretty much the same animal. And I did a whole video comparing if there's a difference between Guiana and Suriname boas, so check out that video for more discussion on this. But I will say that at least biologically, there's really no difference. These are all animals of the same subspecies, boa constrictor, from a population that's contiguous in the Guiana Shield and can theoretically interbreed with each other. And then I'll also confidently say that there's really no way that you could tell just based on looking at the animals if they're really from Guiana or Suriname. There's really no distinguishing characteristics that can tell them apart. Does this absolutely mean that there's absolutely no difference? No, it doesn't, and that was the point of my video. It doesn't even matter to a purist because a boa either came from Guiana or Suriname, and even if you can't tell the difference between them by looking, there is a difference in that one originated from Guiana and one from Suriname. And it gets into that kind of this philosophical argument, but please check out that video if you want more discussion on that area. So the person maybe just neglected to see that there was a different, or neglected to remember that they were Guiana boas originally and now they're calling them Suriname. So the other similar possibility is that the seller considers Suriname and Guiana true red-tailed boas to be synonymous. So basically two ways of saying the exact same thing. I could say that this is a Suriname red-tailed boa, or I could say it's a boa constrictor from Suriname, and most people that would mean the exact same thing. I know it's a little bit contentious whether a Guiana is exactly the same as a Suriname, so for some people that's not really a satisfactory explanation. But if someone doesn't consider them to be different, it's really no different from calling it Guiana or Suriname. I know, not a completely satisfactory explanation, and I'm just kind of speculating here. I don't know what this person's intentions were in changing the name, but I think that that might be a possible explanation for what's going on. I've also seen a similar thing happening in the online reptile classifieds with quite a few other types of locality boas, where one day that they're called one locality, and then another day the same exact boa is labeled as a different locality. And I see this a lot with Peruvian redtails like this one. As you may know, many boa hobbyists recognize two different types of Peruvian redtail boa. There's the type from Iquitos, Peru, and the type from Pucallpa, Peru. I'm not going to tell you which one this one is. And so there are supposedly differences between these two forms, but at least to my eye, it's virtually impossible to really see any meaningful differences between the what's supposedly Pucallpa versus Iquitos. And I've seen numerous boas supposedly originating from Pucallpa or from Iquitos, and their phenotype, their physical appearance really overlaps. So my personal opinion is that there's not any real biological difference between Pucallpa and Iquitos Peruvian boas. And actually I did a whole video on this, so check that video out for more discussion. And so I'll also say that the exact locality of a boa would be where the exact point from where the boa was collected. And Iquitos and Pucallpa are really just export points. The boas are collected from many, many miles around in all directions. So who knows their exact theoretical locality of origin. So for those purposes, I'll say that I'm a little skeptical on the Iquitos versus Pucallpa thing. Although I do still have two separate breeding groups, my Pucallpa Peruvian boas and my Iquitos Peruvian boas, that I'm keeping separate, at least for the time being. So for a long time, the Pucallpa Peruvian boas were harder to get and, higher price than the Iquitos Peruvian boas. And in fact, back 5-10 years ago, there was quite a supply of farm-bred Iquitos Peruvian boas, some of which I was fortunate to add to my collection. And so the prices were a little bit less, and maybe they weren't quite as desirable as the Pucallpa form. However, I think these days any Peruvian boa is going to be probably equally as desirable, and I wouldn't see that there is going to be a major price difference for the same level of quality between Iquitos and Pucallpa. So I would say it's probably less likely that any kind of switch in the name is going to happen for a particular boa. But I did see in the past quite a few examples of somebody that would be selling a boa one day calling it Iquitos, and then you see the pictures of the same boa on the online classified 6 months or a year later, and they're calling it Pacalpa. So, this kind of thing does happen. Yet another example, which also has to do with true redtails, are the Pokegron Suriname true redtail boas. And so the Pokegron Suriname boas are animals which supposedly originated in this small village called Pokegron in Suriname. And so the noted true redtail breeder Gus Renfro of Rio Bravo Reptiles acquired this group of these Pokegron Suriname boas some time ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, and bred them, and he established the Suriname, or the Pokegron Suriname locality. And so all of the Pokegron boas should, in theory, be traceable back to this original group that Gus had bred. However, I see all the time boas being described as Pokegron Suriname true redtails. So I don't think people are going back to Pokegron and collecting more boas. So I just wonder about, are these really legitimate Pokegron Suriname boas? Or is somebody just adding the Pokegron name because that's more exclusive and it's a more valuable animal, and then they can increase the price of the boa by 50 or 80%. To me, it appears that one of the main forces behind this whole phenomenon of localities of boas being changed has to do with the fact that among many collectors, the more exclusive a locality, the more desirable that animal is. For example, if somebody has a boa that's just simply a true redtail boa, it's not a very specific locality, and most collectors would not represent that as a locality boa or something that they would want in their collection. But then if you define it by the country, like a Suriname true redtail boa, it's more exclusive and you can differentiate it from other types of boas, like a Guyana or a North Brazilian, even if biologically there may or may not be any actual difference. But then if you get even more exclusive, you can pinpoint it down to the specific village like Pokegron. In many people's eye, that's an even more exclusive boa, and therefore it must be worthy of even more value and higher market price. And so I'll say that I think maybe we're creating this kind of artificial precision in naming these boas. For example, even if all the boas originate from Pokegron, is a boa from Pokegron really any different from a boa collected from a village 10, 50, or 100 miles away? Also, if you go to this specific village and you look at all the boas, are they all going to be similar to the exact boas which started this whole Pokegron bloodline / locality in captivity? So I would say no, based on looking at online photos on iNaturalist of different Suriname boas. You can go to the exact same location in Suriname and you can find true redtail boas that look different. So is there any real difference between a Pokegron Suriname boa and a non-Pokegron Suriname boa? I would say no. And I think one of the other downsides is that by defining boas more and more narrowly, we're really limiting the captive gene pools, because if you have a boa that supposedly is of one type from this one village, you don't want to breed it with another boa that's not from that same village, because therefore you no longer have something that's pure in the eyes of many hobbyists. And I would say that that's really counterproductive, because we need to manage the captive gene pools of the boas that we have in captivity. And if you're only limiting your breeding group to just one small gene pool of founder animals, you're going to come upon inbreeding depression, and other issues with just such a small gene pool. So it's really counterproductive for people to be more and more narrowly defining locality boas when they don't really have any science to really back up these types of claims. Another example that I saw not too long ago is somebody contacted me because they had a boa that they had purchased as a Peruvian redtail from one of the major reptile suppliers online, and they wanted to know if it was Iquitos or Pacalpa. And so I looked at it. It was a beautiful boa. I told them I can't really tell. There's not really any way you can tell by looking at the picture, but it definitely is consistent with a boa from Peru, or Peru true redtail boa. And they told me that they had asked the supplier after they bought it whether it was Iquitos or Pucallpa. The supplier told them that they didn't know and they couldn't say. And so as a result, the person was now selling the boa at half of the price that they paid for it just to get rid of it, because they felt that it was inferior because it didn't have the Iquitos or Pucallpa moniker. And so that's an example of the problems we create when we come up with these somewhat artificial and arbitrary definitions of what a locality boa is. We create this idea that somehow some animals are better than others, and therefore, in the eyes of many collectors, certain animals have no place in their collection. But I had never heard back from the guy after I told him. To me, it just looked like a nice Peruvian true red tail, so I don't know if he sold it to someone or ended up keeping it for himself. Okay, so if there are boas on the market that have had the locality switched for whatever reason, what's the best way that you can use in order to avoid having this happen to you? And so I would say the first piece of advice is to, whenever possible, buy your boas directly from the breeder. Okay, the breeder is the one that knows the most about the animals. They can answer the questions directly and will probably have a much better handle on what exactly the animal is than somebody that bought it in order to resell it. It's also better to buy directly from a breeder because then the animal is coming right from the source and it doesn't get transported from one person to another and undergo a lot of stress from all of this transport. So these boas that I talked about earlier, one of the things that gets me about people that flip boas like this, it's not just that they increase the price, but they put a lot of stress on these poor animals. Any movement of an animal, shipping at FedEx, it's always going to have some level of stress that you can't control. And then the animal's taken from one environment at one, person's facility, and then put into a completely different facility with another person, and the husbandry and the environment might be different. So there's always going to be some level of stress. But when you have an animal that's being shipped around from one person to another, it's just going to increase the amount of stress and increase the possibility that the animal is going to have some kind of health issue as a consequence. So again, whenever possible, buy the animals from the original breeder and ask a lot of questions. Okay, ask where the breeding stock came from. Ask, what the specific bloodline is, what the person knows about the animals, what the breeding history was, how many times they've been bred, what the size of the litters. Feel free to ask whatever question you want of your breeder. And, most breeders will give you this information. Some of the information might be a little bit personal if they don't want to give it out. Sometimes I can understand why. But most breeders are openly willing to share information about their animals. If they're not, then maybe you should try to find a different breeder. And sometimes the breeders don't know. Sometimes we have animals that come from a bloodline we don't know what it is. And so rather than making something up, it's always best for the breeders just to be transparent, tell the person what they know about the particular animals that they're working with. You should also do your research online and have a pretty good idea about what a certain locality boa is supposed to look like. I know that certain localities you can't tell apart from the picture. For example, we've talked about Guyana and Suriname, but you should have a general idea. And I see a lot of Hog Island boas like this one that are completely mislabeled. Or I should say, a boa that's not a Hog Island boa is mislabeled as a Hog Island boa. And so people have all the time are mislabeling Hog Island boas. If you see an animal that you are questioning whether it's a Hog Island boa, before you even think about buying it, you should go look at pictures of legitimate Hog Island boas like this one. Okay, make sure that your animal is legitimately a Hog Island boa. Sometimes it might be part non-Hog Island boa, you can't even tell. But I've seen many examples of classified ads where the animal is clearly not a Hog Island boa, and yet it's being called a Hog Island boa. If you're in doubt, you might want to ask an expert. Show them the picture, ask them what they think their opinion is, whether it's a Hog Island boa or it's not. The last point that I want you to consider in this video is that in many cases it doesn't really even matter what an animal's exact locality is. Okay, so for locality collectors, of course, locality is important. If you're really into the locality side of the hobby like myself, this of course is of utmost importance. But for a general pet keeper, it really doesn't matter at all where the locality of their boa is. And I get a lot of questions where people send me pictures of boas and they tell me the backstory, you know, this boa was sold to me as such and such, what do you think? And almost always I can't tell them anything, you know, exact. I can say, well, it kind of looks like Central American, but it might have some Colombian mixed in, but that's just my guess. And, you know, for their purposes, this is a pet animal. It really doesn't matter whether it's from Colombia or Costa Rica or Honduras or wherever. In fact, who even knows? It may well have mixed origins, as a lot of the pet store boas do. So really, unless you're into the pure locality side, you really shouldn't even be all that concerned about the exact locality of your boa, and it might well be impossible to tell anyway. So in cases like this, just look at the picture of the boa, decide if you like the boa, if it has the qualities you want in a pet boa, because that's ultimately really what matters. So I hope this video was helpful, and as always, be on the lookout when you see an animal posted with a description of a specific locality, and you might want to think twice about whether the animal really fits that exact locality or not. And of course, I'd love to hear what you guys have to think. I know I raised a few contentious issues here that you might not all agree on, so I'd really appreciate if you comment below what your reaction to some of these issues is. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your boas.